Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that. Hey everyone, this is Carrie Brown and Jonathan Bailor. I brought Jonathan along to make me laugh.
I am here for comedic and scientific relief. Are you ready for both, Carrie?
I am ready for both.
So today, I'm excited because we get to wrap up the 4 factors that determine the quality of a calorie. And we all know that's really important because it's calorie quality that determines the hormonal environment in our body, which determines the aspect of our set point weight that we can control, which is what determines our long-term body composition. So understanding what makes a calorie high or low quality, super important. We've talked about satiety, we've talked about aggression, we've talked about nutrition, and today we're going to talk about the E in SANE, or efficiency. Are you excited, Carrie?
I am.
So efficiency is my favorite because far and away it took the most time to research because it is the least well known. I mean, satiety, how long a calorie keeps you full, how quickly it fills you up, got it. Aggression has to do with glucose and insulin and glycemic load, glycemic index. It's kind of out there. Nutrition, we all know about nutrition, but dividing it by calorie, looking at nutrition density or nutrition quality is new for many people, but pretty well established in the nutrition community. But calorie quality factor 4, or efficiency, really not super well known and hugely important. So we're gonna spend some time on it today, Carrie.
All right, let's do it.
So unlike most areas of life where efficiency is a good thing, when you think about turning food into stored energy or triglyceride or body fat, being able to do that efficiently, not a good thing, right? We do not want to eat foods which are efficiently converted into fat by our body.
No, I do not. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I do not want to be efficient at creating fat.
And a calorie is absolutely, positively not a calorie when it comes to how efficiently our metabolism converts it into body fat. Think about it this way, Carrie. If satiety measures how quickly calories fills us up, and aggression shows us how likely calories are to be stored as fat, and nutrition determines how many nutrients per calorie we get, then efficiency has to do with how easily calories are stored as body fat. The more inefficient a calorie is, the harder it is for our body to store it as body fat, and the better it is for us in terms of our goals of shedding body fat.
Got it.
And when I say it's not an efficient process, what we have to keep in mind, Carrie, is that there's a long road from put food in mouth and final resting place for food in our body, right? There's a lot of chemical and even physiological or physical changes, right? You chew the food, that changes it, it goes into your stomach, that breaks it down even further, it gets broken down even further, it gets turned into glucose. I mean, the food gets broken down and a bunch of chemical reactions have to take place. And certain actions in our body to digest food, they cost calories to do. It's not free for our body to convert, say, a piece of meat into its component amino acids. That's not free. That costs energy to do that.
So it's kind of like what everyone used to laugh about, how it takes more calories to chew celery than you actually ingest in the celery. It's kind of a similar kind of thing.
It's exactly right, Carrie. And there's just many other examples of that. In addition to chewing, calories vary in the efficiency with which our body can process them in many more steps down the road. So let's talk about those. So before we get into that, which is potentially a little bit complicated, but I think it's interesting, let's make sure we all are happy because this fundamentally is simple, because I'm going to spoil it for us all here. I'm going to tell us that just like water, fiber, and protein are what we want to focus on from a satiety, aggression, and nutrition perspective, the same thing applies here from an efficiency perspective. Water cannot be stored as body fat, obviously, so it's just not relevant. Fiber is not digested and therefore can never be stored as body fat. It is completely inefficient because our body tries to digest it. Like we burn a bunch of calories chewing it, we burn a bunch of calories trying to break it down in our digestive system, but we don't, and then our body gives up and it passes through our digestive system. That's why it keeps us regular. because anyway, we all know how that story ends.
You have the nicest way of saying some of the horriblest things.
And then when it comes to, so that was water, fiber, protein, that's the one that I really want to focus on today because it's not as obvious. So, Carrie, let's continue what you mentioned earlier of the whole some foods take longer to chew and then, you burn more calories chewing them. It's not commonly known, but for the average person, about 10% of the calories we burn every day is burnt just converting food into usable energy. So 10% of the calories just automatically burnt basically during digestion. Now, we can actually increase that number by eating inefficiently. So the average American or the average Westerner eats a very efficient diet. It's very high in dry, low fiber, and low protein foods, predominantly starches and sweets, and it does not take much energy at all to convert those foods into body fat.
So that's the road of least resistance.
It is, and that's in fact why if, for example, athletes will often want to consume sugar, the reason for that is yes, that sugar is energy very, very quickly. And if you're sprinting or performing a marathon or doing some sort of distance activity, you need energy right now, very quickly, and you'll burn it off. However, if you're sitting at a desk for most of the day, you don't need efficient energy. You actually need inefficient, sustained energy throughout the day. So let's talk about why protein is so inefficient. So when it comes to actually digesting the food, so breaking it down in our stomach, our body is quite efficient at breaking down fat. It's also quite efficient breaking down carbohydrate. However, our body takes 5 to 10 times more energy to digest protein or to break it down into amino acids. In fact, 1/3 of the calories we get from protein are burnt digesting it. So if you eat 300 calories of protein, this is a simplification, but only 200 of them leave your stomach.
Cool.
Essentially. So they're just burnt off by the act of doing digestion. But, Carrie, the road from, let's say, a chicken breast to love handles goes on much longer because actually, Carrie, there is no road from chicken breast to love handles because protein, even once it's broken down into an amino acid and leaves our stomach, amino acids cannot be stored as body fat. It's like trying to mix oil and water. Like doesn't work that way. If there's excess protein, aka amino acids, available to us that don't need to be used to repair muscle, they are converted into glucose, which is a sugar that is the primary source of energy for most people. Mm-hmm. And this is done in our liver. It's called gluconeogenesis. And it is very calorically expensive, meaning that this chemical conversion that takes place is hard for our body to do. It's difficult to take an amino acid and chemically change it into glucose. And I'm going to be a big science geek here. This is actually pretty amazing, right, Carrie? Like, we have one thing in our body, and our body says, I don't need any more amino acids. So I'm going to do a science experiment. I'm going to turn it into something else. I'm going to convert this from amino acid into glucose. And glucose may sound familiar because glucose, when you eat carbohydrate, it is converted immediately into glucose. Protein is not. It's converted into an amino acid. And if there's excess amino acid, then and only then is it converted into glucose. But the act of converting it burns another third of the original protein calories. So again, if we ate 300 calories of protein, we lost a third of them during digestion. Then we lose another third of them as they're converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis.
But only the ones that we haven't already used up in building muscle or
Correct.
Repairing ourselves or whatever.
Yeah, so this is a fictional experiment where we're not using the calories for anything. So we ate 300, 200 left our stomach, and now we're actually left with only 140 calories. So 300 came in the mouth, 200 left the stomach, and only 140 calories worth of glucose now exist in our bloodstream because of all the processing our body has had to do with it.
Well, that makes me want to eat salmon.
Makes you want to eat salmon, but there's more. There's more, Carrie. So we're at 140 calories. Now, if our body doesn't need that glucose, because it might need that glucose just for energy, but if it doesn't, when we have an abundance of energy, which we can't use, our body is going to store it so we can use it later. So if we now want to take that glucose and our body wants to store it as fat or triglyceride, it has to do another process. It has to make another chemical change. It has to convert glucose into triglyceride. To do that, it costs approximately another 25% of the calories. So now, again, we started with 300, only 200 or so left digestion. Then we were left with about 140 once we converted it to glucose. Once we get to storing it as body fat, and again, this is if we didn't use it for anything, as you said, Carrie, we're at about 105 calories. So even in this mythical world where we don't burn anything, over 2/3 of the calories we consume from protein are burned up simply converting protein into a compound which can be stored as body fat.
Hence you saying that it's inefficient.
It's incredibly inefficient. We're losing, think about this from a survival perspective. If we were in a state of famine, you're not going to want to eat much protein, right? Because if you want to store fat, protein's not going to do that efficiently. It's going to do it horribly inefficiently. We don't have that problem of a shortage of calories in our culture. So if we can move our focus towards eating protein-heavy food, we will burn off many of those calories just through our everyday digestive processes.
Salmon. I want to go and eat salmon.
So we just followed that process, that road from protein to body fat. And it's interesting to contrast that with the road taken by other nutrients, for example. So if we look at that for starch, Carrie, well, you eat starch, it goes into your stomach. When it leaves your stomach, it leaves as glucose. Protein left as amino acid, fat leaves as triglyceride. When the starch is converted into glucose, that's very easy for your body to do. If you were to eat 300 calories worth of starch, about 282 calories worth of glucose would leave your stomach. And again, folks, this is all illustrative and it's not exactly this way, but for our purposes, it's very helpful.
So almost all of it, you don't
burn much. It's like 3 to 5% maybe. And then we talked about with protein, we had to now do this conversion to glucose. Well, remember, we just skip that step completely for carbohydrates since it's already glucose. So now the question is, okay, we've got 282 calories worth of glucose floating around in our bloodstream. If we don't need to use that for energy, then we need to convert it into body fat to store it as triglyceride and store it on our hips or our belly or wherever our body likes to put fat. That still takes some calories to happen. At that point, right, when we talked about protein, we weren't talking about protein. We were talking about protein converted to glucose. Glucose converts to body fat. We're at that same point here, but we have 282 calories to convert into body fat rather than 140 calories. So at the end of the day, we had from 300 calories of protein, about 105 that could be converted into body fat. 211 calories from starch could be converted into body fat.
Got it.
So starch is essentially twice as efficient at being converted into body fat as protein.
Right.
So it's not to say that intrinsically starch is bad. I mean, starch is insane, and we've covered why. But this is just to say, let's look at the science. Let's look at the physical and chemical reactions that happen when we eat food. And it's pretty freaking obvious that a calorie is not a calorie if 2/3 of calories from protein are going to be burnt converting it into body fat, where a little bit less than 1/3 of the calories from starch are burned converting it into body fat.
Right. That makes total sense.
So water, no calories, inefficient. Fiber, no calories, inefficient. Protein, much, much less efficient than carbohydrate or fat. And it is important to note that fat is incredibly efficient. When we eat fat, it leaves our stomach as fatty acids, which are very easily then converted to triglycerides. So this is not to say that, again, it's not that fat is bad. We've covered this ad nauseum. Whole food natural fats are great for you. It's just important to note that when it comes to efficiency, protein is very inefficient, carbohydrate is efficient, and fat is even more efficient. So when we do our 5-star stack rank for the efficiency of food, it's more inefficient the more water, fiber, and protein it has in it. And what is the highest in water, fiber, and protein? Well, things like seafood, high-quality meats, eggs, select low-sugar dairy products, non-starchy vegetables, all of those things, incredibly inefficient. Then we take kind of a big step down and we're looking at things like legumes and nuts and seeds, and then things like fruits and starch and sweeteners, all that stuff, it's pretty efficient. And again, that doesn't mean fruit's bad for you. Remember, we have to look at all 4 of these factors put together. But when it comes to just looking at this one, just efficiency, high quality sources of protein such as seafood and high quality meats and non-starchy vegetables really in a league of their own. Everything else pretty much takes a step down, and then the same things as always. Oils, sweeteners, refined starch, and whole grain starch, incredibly low, incredibly efficient, incredibly easy for our body to store as fat.
That's really eye-opening.
And Carrie, I think it might be helpful with all of this talk, and we kind of already did this, but maybe to do it more explicitly now, really to give just a mini biology lesson here. With all this talk of calories being more or less efficient as being stored as body fat, let's quickly step through the process for all of the macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Carrie, I want us to really geek out here for a second, because I think with all of this talk about calories being more or less efficient at being stored as body fat, I think it's worth covering the process of how new body fat is created, or the process of lipogenesis, or lipo meaning fat and genesis meaning creation. I know it's a bit geeky, but what do you think?
That's what you do.
That's what I do. That's why we're here. We're here to learn science. And so let's do it, Carrie. So we've got food, and we can classify food by its dominant macronutrient. So that means we'll call a food a protein if it gets more calories from protein than it does from fat or carbohydrate. We'll call a food a fat if it gets more calories from fat than it does from protein or carbohydrate. And we'll call a food a carbohydrate if it gets more calories from carbohydrate than it does from protein or fat.
This turned my whole view of the world on its head when
This
I
right
first
here?
read this in the book. It really just, this was startling to me.
All right. Well, I'm going to try to live up to the hype here. So when we look at these definitions of macronutrients, there's really only 6 or so sources of protein: seafood, lean meat, egg whites, whey protein powder, fat-free and low-fat cottage cheese, fat-free and low-fat plain Greek yogurt. Those are the main common foods that get more calories from protein than they do from fat or carbohydrate. Certain things like whole eggs and fatty meats and whole-fat dairy products get most of their calories from fat, so we classify those as fats, along with tofu, which gets most of its calories from fat, oils, and things like nuts and seeds. Now, everything else gets most of its calories from carbohydrate. This is, by and large, why some people call the smarter science of slim a high protein diet, or they call it a high fat diet, when in reality it's neither one of those, because most people inadvertently eat an extremely high carbohydrate diet, because 90% of the food you see in the supermarket is a carbohydrate.
And that's the thing that really did it for me, was you just don't realize, until you look at it this way, you don't realize that carbohydrate is just what you're eating. I mean, it's milk, skinny milk, it's a carbohydrate.
It's a carbohydrate.
I have the hardest time. I still, after 8 months, I have to remind myself that milk is a carbohydrate.
And that's just why, again, people tend to misrepresent things. That's okay. They don't understand the science yet. We do, so we can talk about it here. And with the vast majority of food being a carbohydrate, when we intentionally eat more protein, and when we intentionally eat more whole food natural fats, people can interpret that however they want. The fact remains, avoiding an excessively high carbohydrate diet is not at all the same thing as eating a high protein diet or eating a high fat diet. It's eating a balanced diet. But anyway, we digress. We've got proteins, we've got fats, we've got carbohydrates. So our metabolism gets its hands on protein, fat, or carbohydrate, and it then turns them into, so protein gets converted into amino acids, fat gets converted into fatty acids, and carbohydrate is converted into glucose.
Right.
All right, so we've got those 3 substances: amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose. And this first step is very important, because it's yet another example of a calorie not being a calorie. Once fat is converted into fatty acids, if there are more fatty acids around than we currently need, all of them are sent off to be stored as fat. For example, carbohydrate doesn't work that way. Glucose cannot be stored as body fat. It has to be converted into fatty acids, and it also needs the hormone insulin in order to be stored as fat. And then completely inefficient amino acids from protein come along And before those things can get converted into fat, they need to be converted into glucose. And then once they're glucose, they also need the hormone insulin, or else they too can't be stored as fat. So at that point, Carrie, let's assume that the hormone insulin is available to us and we have glucose on its way to our fat cells. At that point, glucose has to be converted into fatty acids. And remember, this glucose is either coming straight from carbohydrate or from amino acids, which were then converted into glucose.
Yep.
It's then converted into fatty acids, and we're one step away from new body fat. The last step of the process is when those fatty acids combine with a glycerol molecule to form triglyceride, or body fat. And this process is called esterification, and it's not possible without a substance known as glycerol 3-phosphate.
You were not wrong when you said geek out.
So it's super geek out, but we're gonna bring it all back. Don't worry, we're gonna glycerol 3-phosphate. But we're gonna
it's
make it.
It's a good job I trust you.
We're gonna make it all make sense. So quickly, let's summarize here. So it's the process for protein. So predominantly meat and fish, things like that. Protein becomes amino acids. Amino acids go to our liver, which converts them into glucose if it needs to. If insulin is present, it becomes glucose, which then gets converted into fatty acids, which, if glycerol 3-phosphate is present, becomes triglyceride. That was many steps. Let's look at carbohydrate. Carbohydrate converts into glucose. If insulin exists, glucose converted into fatty acids, yada, 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 much shorter path. And let's talk about it for fats now. Nuts, seeds, things like that. Fat becomes fatty acid, and then glycerol 3-phosphate, it becomes triglyceride. So there is a much longer path from dietary protein to body fat than there is for carbohydrate, and then there is from fat. And why is this useful? This is super geeky scientific information, as Carrie so kindly illustrated. Carrie, I'm
supposed to be reeling you in. I'm not doing a very good job
today.
You're
not reeling, but that's because I think you anticipate that there's going to be, I'm going to say 3 very cool ways why this scientific knowledge is useful. You're like, Jonathan has to have a reason for being such a geek right now.
Please get to the cool.
That's so mean. Okay. A calorie, so I'm going to get to the cool now. Cool thing number 1. A calorie is obviously not a calorie, right? If protein is 5 calorie burning steps away from body fat, amino acids, glucose, insulin, blah, 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 whereas fat is only 2 steps away, convert to fatty acids and hook up with glycerol 3-phosphate, calorie is not a calorie.
Right.
It's not. Also, cool thing number 2, it's impossible to store glucose as body fat without insulin. You can't do that. This is why type 1 diabetics die if they do not take insulin, because their body cannot access the energy efficiently. And so we have to have enough insulin. The more aggressive a calorie is, the more insulin it triggers. And this is one of the reasons we don't like aggressive calories. If we don't have a bunch of insulin, we're much less likely to store glucose as body fat. Cool thing. Got it?
In my 112 years on the planet, I've never managed to get my head around diabetes. And there, in about 23 seconds, you just laid it all out for me.
And this is somewhat gross, but you're like, what happens then with glucose? Well, one of the ways people often detect if they have adult onset diabetes is their urine will begin to smell sweet. And if you were so inclined to actually, but I have to say it, to taste the urine of a untreated type 2 diabetic, it would taste sweet. That's because they're actually urinating out glucose. Like there is sugar in their urine because their body cannot absorb it and use it because they do not have the hormone insulin. Fascinating.
Wow.
It has to go somewhere.
That's cool.
So that's cool. And now number 3.
That was worth going through the geek for.
That was worth, okay, number 3.
I waited 112 years for that.
Is remember, like insulin, no body fat gets stored without glycerol 3-phosphate. That substance is needed to convert fatty acids into triglyceride. And Carrie, guess where we get the most glycerol 3-phosphate? Guess. Yes, it's obvious. It all comes together.
The stuff we shouldn't eat.
Yes, insane starches and sweets. Carbohydrates are not bad. Non-starchy vegetables are the most fantastic foods for us in the world, and they're carbohydrate. It's just important to note that insane carbohydrates, starches, and sweets fuel body fat formation. They provide us with an abundance of glycerol 3-phosphate. They provide us an abundance of insulin. They don't satisfy us. They have very little nutrition relative to other foods, and they're incredibly efficient. Put that all together, and Carrie, it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer why eating more smarter works, while eating less does not. When people eat less, they're still overeating because their metabolism slows down. Additionally, they still have plenty of insulin and plenty of glycerol 3-phosphate because of all the insane low-quality starches and sweets they continue to eat. And overeating plus insulin and glycerol 3-phosphate means new body fat.
I totally take it back about you geeking out, because that was the coolest 3 things I've ever heard you say in the 8 months I've known you.
The coolest 3 things. Okay, well, I have 4 more things to say, so we'll see how these 4 stack up to those 3. So we just talked about why eating less doesn't work based on what we just said. Eating less of a traditional Western diet. On the other hand, Carrie, when we eat more smarter, we avoid overeating thanks to high satiety. We get calories into our bloodstream more slowly, and they trigger little insulin because they're unaggressive. Then we maximize the number of nutrients we get from those calories because of their high nutrition per calorie, so our body doesn't think it's starving. And then finally, we burn a bunch of calories during digestion because of the low efficiency. Eating all of this sane food makes us too full for insane starches and sweets. So we're full, we're satisfied, we have a lot of nutrition, and by avoiding starches and sweets, we do not have enough insulin nor glycerol 3-phosphate to fuel body fat formation, free from excess insulin, free from excess glycerol 3-phosphate, free from excess calories because we're not overeating and we're burning a bunch of them during digestion, and because we have a lot of nutrition, we eat more food, we store less body fat, and I'm just going crazy right now. How was that, Karen? Boom!
I'm so glad we kind of sit in the same studio and do this, because watching you get excited is just the bomb. But I did want to say that forget about, eating all this sane food makes us too full for insane food. When you understand just what you've said in the last 10 minutes, why in the world would you even want to eat the starches and sugars when you understand the process and you know what's going to happen? I mean, even if I'm not full, I now don't want to eat them. Sorry, that wasn't nearly as exciting as Jonathan having a
seizure over here, a sane seizure.
But there it is.
No, you're right, Carrie. And not only that, that's just funny. Okay, Carrie just made like a scientific, psychological point. Now I'm going to make the emotional point. Roles are reversed here. And what's even better...
Are you calling me emotional?
Are you calling me unemotional? Touche! What's cool is, in addition to this scientific knowledge empowering us, we're just talking about eating delicious, natural foods, right? We're talking about, let's eat some delicious, organic, grass-fed beef. Let's eat some salmon. Let's eat we can cook that in coconut oil, and we can have natural fats, and we can enjoy colorful, delicious, non-starchy vegetables and delicious fruits like berries and citrus. This isn't some weird deprivation, eat 12 grapefruits and nothing else and feel hungry. And we got, as Carrie would say, the bomb science. I did think you did say the bomb.
I did.
I think, which is awesome in and of itself. So ending on a high note, starting next week, we may do a quick summary. I don't know. I think we've covered a bunch of this stuff pretty well. And then we're going to move on to the third big myth, right? Let's do a quick recap, shall we, Carrie? First couple of podcasts, we talked about how it's not about manually regulating calories in, calories out. Calories in, calories out matters, but we don't need to regulate it. And in fact, our body regulates it for us if our body is working properly. And that's all about our set point hormones, things like that. The second big myth we just finished debunking was that a calorie is a calorie. We absolutely know that's false now, and we have 4 reasons why. Satiety, aggression, nutrition, and efficiency. Sane food's good, insane food's bad. The third big myth is that, well, calories are all that matter, right? Everything we hear about is calories, blah, calories, calories. That's not true. In fact, if we want to say it's all about something, it's really all about hormones. And so we're going to debunk that myth next. So this myth of it's all about calories, it's actually not. It's all about food, and it's all about food because it's all about hormones. And I'm excited. How are you feeling, Carrie? I'm kind of coming down from my high right now. So my SANE high.
It's my turn to get emotional. I just think this is awesome. If people really understand all the research you've done and all the endpoints that you've got to, it changes everything. I mean, everything. And that's really exciting.
And I think it's exciting too, Carrie, because again, we do need a new approach, right? Trying, as you said so well in early podcasts, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is Einstein's definition of insanity. So we've got something new here, and it's not just craziness getting pulled out of Jonathan's back pocket. It's backed by a ridiculous amount of research, and it's good times. So
good times.
Let's do it. Let's eat more. Let's exercise less, smarter, and we'll see you next week. Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review, and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.